Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we are diving into 4 brand new studies that are pretty much guaranteed to make you rethink some things you probably thought you knew.
We all lean on common sense, right? But what happens when science comes along and proves that the most obvious answer is completely wrong? Well, that's exactly what we're looking at today. We've got some amazing findings that are going to turn your expectations on their head. So let's jump right in.
So, the big idea here is that science often reveals a world that's way more complex, way more nuanced than we give it credit for. We're going to explore 4 incredible studies that show this perfectly, and they cover everything from medieval history all the way down to our own immune systems.
Okay, first up, we're heading into the natural world. We've got 2 new studies here that are really challenging some of our most basic beliefs about our impact on the environment.
So think about this for a second. It seems totally logical, right? The Black Death sweeps through and wipes out maybe half of Europe's population. Suddenly, farms and villages are just abandoned. You'd think, wow, this must have been a huge win for nature, a massive rewilding event that let biodiversity bounce back like crazy.
But get this, a study from the University of York found the exact opposite. By digging into fossil pollen records, researchers basically pieced together what happened, and it looks a lot like this chart. It shows that in the 150 years after the plague, plant biodiversity didn't boom, it plummeted. As all those carefully managed farms were left to go wild, they just got replaced by less diverse forests. The overall variety of plants actually took a huge hit.
And here's the kicker. The big takeaway is that humans and nature aren't always enemies. Turns out that traditional kind of farming and land use can create this beautiful patchwork quilt of different habitats. You've got woodlands next to pastures, ponds, different crops, and that variety actually supports more biodiversity than one giant, uniform forest left to do its own thing.
All right, so our relationship with the land is way more complicated than we thought. But what about the animals on that land? We kind of have this idea that when we build roads or farms, every wild animal just wants to run for the hills and get as far away from us as possible. But is that really true?
Well, some researchers from Radboud University looked at wildlife corridors down in Botswana and found that different species have wildly different reactions to us. I mean, just look at this. It sums up the contrast perfectly. Elephants, they do everything they can to avoid us. Baboons, on the other hand, they show way more tolerance.
And when you dig into the details, it gets even more interesting. Sure, most animals just shifted to being active at night to stay out of our way. But how they used a space was all over the map. Elephants? They gave farms a wide berth. Baboons and hyenas? Not nearly as bothered. And warthogs? They actually seem to prefer corridors in more built-up areas. It's just more proof that a one-size-fits-all approach to conservation is never going to work.
This idea that there's no single one-size-fits-all answer, that doesn't just apply to animals, it applies to us too. So let's pivot a bit. We're going to go from the natural world to the world inside our own heads and figure out what's really driving our choices when it comes to the environment.
Okay, so a study in the Journal of Consumer Psychology came up with this really powerful idea called perceived prevalence. And what it boils down to is this. How effective we think something is, say an environmental action, depends a lot on how many of our friends and peers we actually see doing it.
And it turns out our social circles shape this perception in a huge way. For instance, the study found that if people in a certain social group just don't see a lot of their peers doing things like recycling, they're much more likely to assume that those actions just don't have a very big impact anyway. So it's not always about deep-seated values. A lot of the time, it's just about social perception. That's what's predicting behavior. So the big question is, how do you fix that? How do you bridge that gap? Well, the study tested 3 solutions that actually worked. First, you reframe the benefit. Instead of an environmental thing, they pitched biking as a health choice, and poof, the political gap just disappeared. Second, get super specific. Tell people that buying a bracelet removes exactly 5 pounds of ocean trash. Suddenly, everyone was equally on board. And third, and this is a big one, show people that their own peers are already doing it. That's social proof. It's incredibly powerful.
All right, for our last study, we're going to get a little more personal. This one is all about the direct and honestly kind of mind-blowing link between the food you eat and your body's power to fight off disease. So, researchers at the University of Queensland found something amazing. The fats you eat literally change the physical makeup of your T cells, the soldiers of your immune system. And this chart here does a great job of breaking it down. Basically, a diet with more monounsaturated fats, we'll call them MUFAs, compared to polyunsaturated fats, or PUFAs, makes your T cells physically tougher and a lot more resilient.
And just to make that super practical, PUFAs are the fats you'll find in stuff like fatty fish and soybeans. The MUFAs, the ones that seem to make our T cells stronger, are in things like olive oil and avocados. So it really is all about getting that balance right.
And how this works is just incredible. See, T cells can be destroyed by something called oxidation, where fats basically wreck their outer layer. But the right balance of fats in your diet essentially gives them a suit of armor. It makes them more resistant to that damage, so they can stick around and do their job, which is, protecting you.
And the potential here is just massive. I mean, stronger, more resilient T cells don't just mean you fight off a cold better. The research is suggesting this could be a huge boost for treatments like vaccines and even cancer immunotherapies, places where the strength of a patient's T cells is absolutely everything.
Okay, so let's tie all of this together. We've gone from ecosystems to psychology to the cells inside our own bodies, and in every single case, we've seen how these simple, common-sense assumptions just totally fall apart when you look a little closer.
So let's do a quick recap. We found out that after the Black Death, the absence of humans was actually bad for plant diversity. We saw that wildlife doesn't have one single reaction to us. It's all over the place. We learned that our green choices have as much to do with our social circles as our politics. And finally, that the specific fats you eat can literally make your immune cells stronger.
What's the common thread here? In every single one of these stories, the simple, obvious answer was, well, it was wrong. The world is just a much more complex, interconnected place than we think. And these studies really show that digging into that nuance, that's where the real magic, the real understanding happens. Questioning what we think we know is how we find out what's actually true.
And that really leaves us with one last thing to think about. After seeing how easily these huge common-sense ideas can be completely flipped on their head by new evidence, it kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? What's some obvious truth, some piece of common sense you rely on every day, that maybe you should start questioning next?